interrupt our day earlier, so we're a little off kilter. But I want us to get right back on schedule if at all possible. This would give us from 2:27 to 4:27 for 2 hours. But Dr. Brabrand, if you want to launch us off with what is the ask, I think it's very important to frame this conversation that by the end of this conversation, you're going to be asking us to do something. And I think it's important leaping off point to start with that.
Before you do that, though, rather than giving a full 2 hours to this portion of the day, let's see if we can cut it back to closer to 4 o'clock. And the reason I say this, it's now 2:17, is that if you look at the outcome, we're focusing on high schools only. And so I agree that this deserves a fuller discussion, but I also know that we're losing a number of board members early today, and so we want to make sure that we can keep as many folks at the table when we start our resource stewardship discussion.
Well, I'm a pretty good train driver, so I will do my best, but everybody has to decide to stay on the train and going in the same direction.
I'm just setting expectations.
So whatever cooperative nature everybody feels like will determine whether we go 2 hours or not. And Dr. Brabrand?
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. The outcome I'm asking for today is for the school board to provide direction to me and my team regarding the expansion of FCPSOn for high schools only in the FY 2020 proposed budget. We have a placeholder in there right now. The board asked us to look at multiple options, which we have in the presentation, but our recommendation is a high schools only approach, and we're only talking about next year. This board can choose over time to accelerate FCPSOn, to pause. We're talking about next year's budget for high schools only. And I also just want to say it's important for the board. FCPSOn has been in the Ignite strategic plan for some time. FCPSOn aligns with One Fairfax and a focus on equity and on closing the achievement gap. And I have to tell you, coming back to Fairfax with all the discussion about trying to get all of these technology companies to come to Northern Virginia for workforce development purposes, our high school kids need to have the tools of learning for the 21st century. And technology is part of the pencil and paper of the 21st century. So I believe FCPSOn has arrived. Our folks are ready to do the work, and we look forward to your support. This will give us direction not only for the budget, but for the massive amount of implementation work we need to do to be ready to hit the ground running next year and have a successful launch. So I thank you, and I know Dr. Presidio and his team have a great presentation.
So Ms. Palchik, I'm sorry, do you have a clarifying question before we start?
I just want to get on the list. Thank you.
Oh,
That's all.
now? Okay.
Yeah, no.
All
Thank
right,
you.
Dr. Presidio.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Brabrand, for the introduction. And we're going to get on the FCPSOn Express here in just a second, so hang on with me. But I do have some special guests here that we want to make sure that we introduce. And first is Kimberly Scott, who you might remember is the FCPS 2015 Teacher of the Year. And she's the English teacher at Chantilly High School. And we have, yes, clap for her. And we also have Erin Leonard, who is the principal of Fairfax High School with us, and we want to clap for her as well. And you're hearing a lot of support behind Dr. Brabrand in the audience there because we have a number of principals from all three of the associations who are here with us today. So while we're only talking about funding for the FY20 budget, we are going to talk about the entire FCPSOn initiative as a whole, which is an elementary, middle, and high school initiative. So to go very quickly, I did promise the meeting managers we'd preserve as much time for discussion as possible, and I'm going to try to do this in about 15 minutes, and I am watching the clock. So you see the topics that we're going to dig into and dive into here. And the main thing that we want to do, again, is to preserve enough time for discussion with the board. So to jump off, we want to start just by reminding folks what the mission of FCPSOn is. And as you know, and as we've been communicating to folks in the community, FCPSOn is really about equitable access to technology, yes, but also, and more importantly, to those instructional practices that are going to lead to portrait of a graduate outcome. So when we talk about fidelity of implementation and best practices, This is a best practice that we are really focusing on as a key strategy to get us to Portrait of a Graduate. So what exactly would that look like, though, when we talk about the instructional approach? Well, when we talk about the instructional approach to FCPSOn, we're really talking about how to leverage those technology tools in a way that are going to support inquiry. So research, problem solving, critical thinking, analysis, presentations of learning, and not working just with technology, but in a blended approach. So some things are happening in a digital environment, and many things are continuing to happen in a brick and mortar face-to-face environment. And the big distinction that I always want people to remember about FCPSOn is we're talking about using technology for creation, not consumption. We're not talking about students sitting passively in front of a digital curriculum. We're talking about using technology as a tool to leverage an approach to inquiry in Portrait of a Graduate. On the device side, we're talking about every student in grades 3 through 12, eventually, if the board should choose to expand us that far, having an individual learning device that they work on at school and take home with Wi-Fi connectivity. And in grades K through 2, students would use devices in the classroom only as age appropriate. So when we think about the opportunities for this initiative, they're numerous, but there are a number of responsibilities that we also recognize. We've done a lot of community outreach, and we've heard from parents and folks in the community that have done a good job reminding us of our responsibilities. So I wanted to take just a couple minutes here to talk about both those opportunities and the responsibilities. On the opportunity side, again, we've talked about this a lot in the past, so I'm not going to dig into it too much here this afternoon unless there are questions. But we think the alignment of technology as a learning tool is very tight as it comes to thinking about ways to leverage technology to get to Portrait of a Graduate outcomes, as I had said previously. So we can unpack what some of those practices would look like more specifically in our discussion if you'd be interested. Additionally, though, we have not talked as much about the opportunity of supporting learner-centered instruction. And we really believe that FCPSOn promotes teachers' ability to develop learner-centered instruction, individualizing the learning experience for students. So, for example, adjusting the path of learning. So that's giving students choice and adjusting the levels of learning materials to individual students' needs. We think with FCPSOn, teachers can do a better job of adjusting the pace of learning, so students can work at their own speed and at their own pace. And we really believe that teachers can expand the time and the place of learning. So yes, learning happens in the classroom, but with FCPSOn, that learning extends outside of the classroom and into the home as well. An additional opportunity as we talk about our high school focus today is the opportunity around college and career readiness. You know, more and more employers are looking for students that have technology fluency and innovation skills, and FCPSOn allows students to use technology in authentic real-world environments and develop those skills that employers are going to expect are basic skills in the modern workforce. And we think that we've got a moral obligation to make sure that our students are prepared with those skills when they leave us here in FCPS. Additionally, there's this opportunity around consistent access. Occasionally folks have asked, well, why does everybody need to have the same device? Why is that important? We have bring your own device. Why isn't that enough? Well, as teachers, I think, will tell you, teachers did not get into education to be technology specialists, right? They didn't get into education to fix computers and manage devices, right? So when we have consistent devices, teachers can expect that every student's going to have one. They don't have to try to figure out how to check out the laptop carts, when those might be available, when they might not be available. And they don't have to worry about fixing technology. They can focus on teaching because the machines are going to be there and they're going to be supported and available for use. Additionally, a common device platform is really, really important when we talk about issues of safety and privacy, and we can dig into those a little bit more in our discussion as well if you would like. So shifting to the responsibility side, as I said, there are a number of responsibilities that we take very seriously, and the first is around digital citizenship. And I really do understand the need for us to continue to do more in the area of digital citizenship, but this is an area I would point out that I actually think we're a national leader. We have taken many steps in FCPS far beyond what other school systems have done. For example, and we've worked with the board and the board's encouragement in asking us to do that, and we appreciate that support. But for example, we're requiring digital citizenship lessons in every grade level. We've developed a lot of resources and curriculum for teachers to use beyond those required lessons across the curriculum. And we know that parents need help with this as well at home. And as I think the board knows, I've got 2 children of my own in elementary school, and I understand how difficult sometimes it can be when you're trying to figure out how to set limits on device usage. And we think that we have a role to play in supporting parents. So one of the things we've done is we've developed a course that parents can take with their students online that talks about how do you promote healthy and responsible digital citizenship use. Additionally, we've been doing a lot of work recently with the Fairfax County Council of PTAs. Just this Wednesday coming up, the FCC PTA is sponsoring a film titled Screenagers. We will be there participating in that screening as well and talking about resources and support that we can provide to parents on these issues as well. So we're doing a lot of work in digital citizenship. Of course, we can always do more, but I think this is an area that we've really demonstrated our leadership and responsibility. Additionally, we've got responsibility around supporting healthy student use. And we've taken a lot of actions in this regard as well. And the first thing that I would point out is we have a really extensive technology review process that we make sure that we vet programs before we ever even bring them into our educational space. So we make sure that we're only bringing in interactive, high-quality, rigorous instructional programs. We're also developing guidelines right now with our schools to talk about how to set limits on screen time, both in school and at home. And the biggest factor, I think, when I actually have an opportunity to speak individually with parents is their concern around cell phone use. And cell phones are just so ubiquitous today. I mean, you see them as kind of commonplace and even in elementary schools. And if we can get to one-to-one in all of our schools, then we can put policies in place that would prohibit the use of cell phones in our classrooms, because there would be no reasonable instructional purpose to have those, because students would have the devices that they need and be able to use them for instructional purposes. So we'll continue to work on this issue. And safety and security is the other big area of responsibility that we have. And I think this, again, is an area where parents need to kind of recognize that what we can provide with an FCPS issued device actually is safer and more secure probably than what just about any parent could offer in their home. What we have in terms of our network filtering, content filtering, and network security is far superior to what an individual family would be able to provide at home. And the filtering and the security features that are in place, those work obviously when you're in school in FCPS, but those work when you're at home as well. So this actually is a way to really promote safety and security through the use of a common system and a common device. Additionally, I would say we've had some questions about our responsibilities around student data. And I think it's always important to remember that the policies that we have in place around vendor responsibility are some of the strictest policies that I certainly have ever seen. We require our vendors to sign confidentiality agreements, and we hold them to the highest standards to ensure that they are not going to do anything to jeopardize or compromise confidential information as it pertains to student data use in FCPS. So continuing to move quickly, I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly for just a second to give us a different kind of perspective from the classroom about FCPSOn.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the amazing teachers of the Chantilly Pyramid. This is my 14th year in Fairfax County after 10 years of teaching in 4 other states. I am very proud to call this district my permanent home. In every state that I taught prior to coming here, my colleagues and I read about and knew that Fairfax County Public Schools is a paragon of outstanding instruction and especially of innovation. I dreamed of being a part of it someday, striving always for the best. My experiences as a Fairfax County teacher have not disappointed. I have honed my craft because of the opportunities and challenges set before me, including those focused on technology. I'd love to tell you about the timeline of my personal experiences, from overhead transparencies to an almost paperless approach, but because of time, I'll speak directly to this initiative. It may surprise you to know that I was originally a skeptic. Why? Before FCPSOn, my colleagues and I did our best to innovate with the computer labs and personally owned devices scattered through the building. but outcomes would often stall, usually because of inadequate bandwidth or lack of devices. And I would reflect that I could have accomplished more without the technology. It was just too hard to schedule, too unreliable. I also worried that colleagues might use technology for bells and whistles, even when a paper pencil approach would have been the better option. Why drive your car next door to the neighbor's house when you can walk, I would ask. I was a doubting parent, too. The education my daughter was receiving, sans personal device, was exemplary. I even feared that this trend might move towards teaching being assigning, with the teacher relegated or resigned to scheduler of learning events. What changed? A lot. When the Chantilly Pyramid received the honor of implementing FCPSOn, I joined the Franklin training team, mostly because I was wary. As a teacher, leader, and department chair, I wanted to be sure that not too much would be expected of teachers and that instructional approach, not bells and whistles, with adequate hardware and ongoing support would be the focus. I wanted to be sure the teachers of my department would not feel pressured to become Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, that each would still be seen as a content expert in the room. My colleagues and I were already known for excellence. I wanted to be sure that FCPSOn would not be a gimmicky replacement for it. And I wanted to ensure that what I heard Sharon Eisenberg, my principal, and Teresa Johnson, then principal of Chantilly High School, saying, just take one step, try one thing, would be valued, would be repeated, and would be enough. That is exactly what has happened. This initiative works because of equity, support, and expectation with vision. The FCPSOn initiative has brought access to every student and teacher. My students today treat their laptop, which I no longer have to schedule, as a sophisticated and necessary school supply, and they are becoming 21st century creators because of it. The initiative also works because of support, digital and human. It's readily available. My experiences at both the middle and high school levels during implementation have impressed me that it's being done right. Teachers have been supported by our principals who give ongoing encouragement that taking one strategic step, the next strategic step, even if momentary failure interrupts it, that's growth. Teachers have T-specs who are computer whisperers. They appreciate SBITs, like those in the room, who serve as teachers of teachers and cheerleaders of innovation. And we have each other. The pyramid-wide esprit de corps created by this initiative has been surprising. One more reason for success, we teachers need to be pushed just a little bit, always to renew our vision. Just as our students need to be told that learning is an ongoing journey, not a destination, we need you as system leaders who say the world, its ways of working and collaborating is changing. We need you to change too, and we will give you the tools and the support you'll need. When other necessities are in place, this is not too much to ask, not at all. So come visit me in room 213. What you'll see is a room without past limitations. During any typical class, my students have their laptop screens up and then down, up and then down. You might compare it to swimming lessons. We're all at the pool together. I'm an expert swimmer, but everyone is getting wet. Equity of practice and expression, individual accountability, unlimited resources, ample support. Through resources such as Google Classroom and others, I collaborate real time with my students as they create individually or with each other. Or I can ask for screens back down and go back to direct teaching because I see the need, real time. I interact with each student by name and by need more than I ever did before. So while the one-to-one laptop is certainly not the only instructional tool I consider and use, my goodness, it is an extraordinary tool. Thank you for providing it. I can't imagine going back, and I hope your decision is to empower my colleagues around the county to move forward with me.
All right, well, thank you very much to Kimberly. Now she reminded us, yes, please give her a round of applause. She reminded us again why she was Teacher of the Year. And it's a shame we cut you off to 3 minutes, but we'll have an opportunity to have some discussion with the board here in just a second. So just a few more slides that I wanted to address. One is a follow-on to a question that some board members asked the last time we had a work session, which is, where are other school systems? We are not the leader when it comes to FCPS in the space of one-to-one technology. We're the leader in many things, but one-to-one technology we are not. You can see from the chart that there are many school systems just within the state of Virginia and even surrounding us that are far ahead of us with their implementation of one-to-one technology. Additionally, I just wanted to touch on the level of community support, because you will remember that we have a couple opportunities to get stakeholder information. One is through our Johns Hopkins program evaluation process, and another is through a countywide survey that we were doing called Bright Bites. And you can see just from what's on the chart here that the majority of teachers and parents, when we ask them questions about their level of interest in technology and support for technology-infused instruction, is actually quite high. So we certainly understand that this is a big decision in terms of thinking about when to implement and how to implement additional schools for FCPSOn. So we wanted to provide just a little bit of a framework to help with that discussion and frame that discussion a little bit. And the first is around what are some of those opportunities. So as we've said, the opportunities first and foremost really are around equity to technology and to instructional practices aligned to Portrait of a Graduate. Additionally, number 2 on this chart, we firmly believe that FCPSOn financing, the financial model that Ms. Burden is going to talk to us about in a little bit, really provides kind of a forecast of expenditures and helps us think about technology expenditures with more certainty. When we just think about technology needs from school to school and we don't think about it at the system level, it's hard to get a handle and predictability of what those expenses might be. But the FCPSOn model provides a 4-year, multi-year process of looking at budgeting that helps us really understand what those future costs are and to be able to plan effectively and efficiently to meet those costs. And a strategic approach to professional development is included in FCPSOn. We spend a year with each level of schools prior to machines ever showing up, providing professional development and doing community outreach at the school level. And that is only going to help us when it comes to actually being able to implement the device well. On the challenges side of course, we have to think about cost. We have to think about those responsibilities that we discussed, digital citizenship, healthy technology habits. And then, as Kimberly said, that last one is really important. We can't expect everything to be perfect and everybody to change all their practices, instructional practices overnight. That's going to take time, and it's going to require us to provide the support and the patience in making that change happen. So we have 2 different implementation options we wanted to share today. The first is the one we've shared previously, which is by level. So you see the expansion of FCPSOn from its pilot would go to the high schools in the 2019-2020 school year. And we've already begun trying to provide that professional development and the community engagement at our high schools this school year, and we're going to continue to do that this year. But following the high school expansion, we would then go to the middle school level and grades 5 and 6, and then grades 3 and 4 in the subsequent years. So that was the option that we had provided to the school board previously for implementation. But at the last work session during the summer, the board had asked for an alternative implementation option, which is option 2, provided here. And this would be a pyramid-based approach to implementation, which we would propose would start with those pyramids that have the highest percentages of economically disadvantaged students. And you can see what those particular pyramids would be over that same 4-year period of time. On the financing side, we can dig into this a little bit more during the discussion period, but you see from the finance chart the revenue and expenditures that we put together for both of these approaches. So this is by level, and this is by pyramid. And finally, we just want to kind of end where we started with the recommendation on the part of the superintendent and staff is that we do move forward and include funding in the 2020 budget for high school expansion of FCPSOn following option 1. And you can see some of the rationale for that that we've provided here. One is it helps us to spread the fees, and we can talk about that more in a minute as well. But it also aligns to the timeline that we've developed for adoption of new resources, both digital and non-digital basal resources. And the idea of equity across the grades is something that's been really important. It's one of the things that a number of board members have brought up, is that some high schools have this technology now, and some don't. And we feel that urgency to begin the implementation at the high school level, where those students are going to leave us and enter college and enter careers very soon, in the very near future. And we need to make sure we're doing everything to prepare them for success when they do so. So with that, we'd like to conclude, and I think I went to about 23 minutes, so I apologize for that. But we'd like to open it up for discussion.
Okay, so I first have Ms. Palchuk, then Ms. Sanders, then Ms. McLaughlin. Oh, no. Ms. Palchuk, Ms. Strauss, Ms. Corbett Sanders, and then we'll go on.
Okay, thank you. And I did want to speak first because this is probably our third, fourth work session on this. Seventh, okay, thank you. Over a couple of years. And I do, and I feel a little anxious to move forward and to give our schools the support to move forward. But I wanted to clarify a few things that I think, we've been hearing and want to make sure we're addressing. But before that, you spoke to one of my points. I wanted to share that as a classroom teacher, I was both at a school that transitioned to one-to-one, and then at a school that was back in BYOD. And the stark contrast between being able to rely on the technology, on the safety and security of the technology, on the kids knowing how to get on their device, get to work, and not waste class time, was just immense. It really drove the point home to me that we need to have that for our students and for our teachers. So I fully support moving forward, and I'll ask a couple of questions. I feel that we are ready at the high school level, and I want to hear a little bit more when I'm done, the one versus the other. It seems like the recommendation is for our current model, but then, if we were to go with the other model, what it would mean, and your professional thoughts on that, and from our principals. But number one, I'm glad you brought it up, the cell phones, and more and more conversations I have with parents, principals, staff, is that, can we really say, that this device will help us replace these screens that, sitting here, we generally have 3 to 4 of our screens, but hopefully can focus on the more productive laptop ones. So can we, and probably working with our principals, figure out what does it mean for our cell phone policy, and truly making a commitment to moving away from that, especially in the classroom. So that I would love to talk about and hear more about. The equity piece is huge, and I agree. And at this point, equity, and some of our schools have it, some of them don't. Students having both the laptops, but also the access to Wi-Fi. So I know the MiFi devices help with that, but just want to ensure that our kids won't suddenly be expected to do things at home that they then cannot do at home. So want to hear from you more on that. And I do. I think our kids are going from here, and I want kids to be ready to be successful in college and career, and to have the support they need and to have the experiences they need. So, but there are some challenges. Screen time, and I know you brought that up, and one of them is policies. Another one is building awareness, right? So are we working toward building awareness for teachers, for staff, for kids, as to their screen time? And we probably need it too. And then looking at how to counter that with our instructional practices, increased movement, breaks, brain breaks, nature breaks, teaching our kids how to spend time away from their devices and socializing and talking in person. So I don't think it's an and or, but it's an and, not an or. And finally, the digital citizenship recently just happened to pop into the classroom. They happened to be doing cyberbullying lesson in a 5th grade classroom. I was blown away by the level of conversation, the problem solving that the kids were coming up with for how to address possible scenarios. It really, to me, felt like a best practice. Common Sense Media, I know, helps with a lot of those lessons. So I agree with you. The laptop is this necessary and sophisticated device, and we want our kids to see it that way. It's not going away. So how do we encourage them? So I guess my main questions would be, the two different models, and really get a sense of if we really are going with the first one, your opinion on that. And then B, the cell phone policy. What do we do to get there? And then C, ensuring that we do have that, both the awareness and the training and the implementation of issues related to screen time, movement breaks from technology, and awareness. So thank you, and I hope to hear from you and from our principals with teachers as well.
All right, very good. So you've got at least 3 really good questions there. So let's just kind of dig in, and I'll start, and certainly anybody else up at the table, feel free to add in as well. But on the implementation model, I think was really your first question, and just talking a little bit more about those 2 different options. So the first option is the one that, again, that we've presented in previous work sessions and really discussed, and it's the one that we've really privileged in our thinking, because we felt like we needed to backwards map the students. We believe that there's urgency for all levels. I mean, let me be clear about that first of all. I don't want to equivocate about that. But we believe the greatest level of urgency for this initiative is at the high school level, because students are going to be expected to develop the technology skills that we've been discussing here today in a very brief period of time. So if we don't go with this by level option, right, and we go with the pyramid option, we're going to have some high school pyramids that wouldn't have access to this type of device, this type of instructional approach for at least 4 years. And that's going to create and perpetuate a pretty large inequity across some of our high schools. So in our thinking, it makes more sense to start at the high school level. We can continue over the course of this year to, and again, we can continue to work with Johns Hopkins. They're going to work with us again this year. We can look at the research. We can really study the efficacy of what's happening in the high school implementation. And we can come back next year and have a similar conversation with the board. And assuming that things are going well at the high school level, the board could decide to expand to the middle school level, right? Same thing after the middle school. We can come back and have a conversation, see if we think that everything is going well, and if we're confident that we're meeting our responsibilities, then we can have a conversation with the board about expanding to the elementary level. But if you go with the pyramid level model, you've got a mixture of grade levels with devices that doesn't really give the board as many opportunities to pause and reflect before expanding further. Because to not expand further at that point would be to perpetuate more inequities in the system. So for those reasons, that's why we're really recommending and privileging option 1.
And then
And your second question, I think, was about cell phones and cell phone policy. So this is something, again, you can see a lot of the principals are here, right? So I'll answer this, and if anybody jumps out of their seat and wants to jump in, I certainly would welcome that, and I think Aaron certainly is welcome to jump in as well. But this has been one of the areas, I think, of great frustration for our principals, is really understanding that cell phones can have an instructional purpose if used appropriately, but oh my goodness, who wants to try to manage that in a classroom setting, right? It's a classroom management nightmare. So we have allowed students to bring in their own devices, including cell phones, but when we talk to principals and teachers, one of the #1 frustrations is how to get this distraction of a device out of the instructional process. And you hate to create a blanket policy when students don't have access to technology for some of the instructional needs that they have. So we've kind of been living in this gray area where it's been really, really difficult to manage. And we see this as a huge benefit if students do have access to the appropriate kinds of devices, right? Where we have filtering on the devices, so students aren't going to be using them for entertainment or social media because those things are going to be blocked. They're not blocked now if a student doesn't register their device because they're going to get that information through their cellular plan, right? So we can eliminate that and eliminate many of those distractions and frustrations and aggravations out of the classroom process. Erin?
So I'll just speak. So I'll just speak to the cell phone piece particularly. I think that it's going to take some time to sort of undo what's already been done. So, I don't know that going fully to FCPSOn is going to do away with cell phone use in the classroom, but it can certainly strengthen our argument as far as when they have it out and when they don't have their cell phone out as well. And some parent education around that piece too, because parents really believe if I need to reach my child, I need to reach my child, so that they need the cell phone. So I think there's that aspect as well, and just our coming together and reteaching the community as far as technology use and responsible technology use. And I think once we go to FCPSOn and we do have that equity among high schools, we can really open up and engage that conversation as a community.
I don't know, I guess I would love to ask as the next step to make sure that we have a process, because that's my understanding, is that we won't just do it overnight, but I want to make sure we're committed to doing it appropriately and with our stakeholders, and the integrity of implementation as well on that. So if we could maybe make sure that while we're implementing high school, if we move forward, that we are kind of working on the cell phone policy and reporting back to the board on how that's going.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. And then your third question, was it around screen time? Could you restate it for me?
So I guess both helping, figuring out how to give support and guidance, whether it's policy, best practices, on both awareness when it comes to screen time for students, for teachers, for staff, but then figuring out what are policies, and that we need to implement, whether it's around screen time, but then also movements and breaks, technology breaks, to both support teachers and staff, and then maybe think about appropriate.
So one of the things I mentioned on the healthy use slide that we talked about is we actually have developed some draft guidelines and are working on those right now with schools, trying to get feedback from teachers. And those guidelines really do talk about making sure that you're using technology for the types of purposes that we've discussed here, right? So making sure that the technology is value added, first of all, right? Not just designing a lesson to use technology for technology's sake, but what is the additive value of the technology? Really getting clear about the responsibility to have a blended and balanced approach to technology use. I think, and Kimberly did a really good job saying, really recognizing when's the right time to use it, when should your screen be up, when should your screen be down, right? Really helping think through the process of designing purposefully and intentional lessons for when to use technology, when it makes sense, and when perhaps it's not best to use technology. Really making sure that we don't lose face-to-face connections and relationships. We can collaborate and communicate via technology, and that's really important, but it's also really important to have the human connection as part of the educational experience and as part of the classroom environment. So really asking people to think critically about how they're designing and supporting human relations and culture of the classroom, and what that looks like and what the expectations for that would be.
Okay.
We've put a few, okay, just, I'm sorry, did you? Oh, okay, I'll wrap this one up very quickly, and I apologize. And one of the other things that that you mentioned is those breaks, those mindfulness breaks. We're really trying to incorporate things like the 20-20-20 rule, that every 20 minutes that you're on a device, you need to pause, get off of the device. For at least 20 seconds, you need to be focusing at something 20 feet away to avoid eye strain. So we're putting together a lot of processes and guidelines and standards like that right now.
Okay, I need to move on because I've got some. I have Janie, then Karen, Corbett Sanders, then Megan.
Okay, first of all, this is very exciting. Thank you very much. I absolutely agree with the rollout at all high schools. And I am very grateful the way you all are partnering with the PTAs, because the parents are obviously concerned, very concerned about obviously the cell phone use and access to places where we don't want kids to go. But part of my response is that if we own the device, we control what's on the device. We control the use and the accessibility, even when it's not with us. And it would give us an opportunity to begin to control the cell phone use, because that really is the problem. I think we absolutely have to move forward. I mean, this is the 21st century tool. And I also appreciate your emphasis on creating rather than consuming, and all the things that you just said, building in how we use it for inquiry, how we use it for analysis, also closing the digital divide, which is absolutely critical. We cannot have students graduate from high school and not have all of this as part of their base toolkit. They would just not be ready to go on. So that part is critical. I do think starting with the high school, that really I think is the first need. I think both teachers and students and families and parents, I think, can understand that. And it gives us an opportunity to continue to look at how we're doing and whether or not we, certainly there's different sensibilities as to when we get to the very youngest children, which I understand. So by starting with the oldest, where the critical need is. I also am very grateful for the recommendations that we've had in the funding of this and being able to have an actual refresh cycle. So it's the first time that that's what's built in, which is critical because that's been part of our problem. And we are behind. We are truly behind. But I think we have all the pieces in place. I'm glad that we have partnered with Johns Hopkins so that we can evaluate as we're going along because we want to make sure that we're using the money well, that it is actually advancing teaching and learning, never technology for technology's sake. So I think we need to go on. I see all the wonderful people here. And I hope that my colleagues have read the great editorial from the students at McLean High School. I sent it to you, I think, on Thursday. The title is Implementing One-to-One Computing Will Propel FCPS in the 21st Century. So the students definitely, and they see it closing the digital divide, access to powerful tools, and goodness gracious, we're behind. Let's get this thing done. So
Do you have any specific questions, Janie?
No.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your proposal.
Thank you.
Okay, I have Karen, then Megan, then Sandy.
And I'll try to be quick. First, thank you very much. I do fully support a high school only approach at this point. I think that's the right place to actually see this come to fruition across the whole county, and I do believe it's a more equitable approach, especially since many of our learning backpack schools or schools that have deployed one-to-one with PTA supports, there's no refresh policy, and so this will address much of that. I do have some questions. I'm a little bit concerned about metrics and how we're going to keep metrics associated with screen time use, actually the effectiveness of the teaching models that are being used so that we are able to identify where it's technology for technology's sake or whether it's actually a value added, and also that 2020 rule. So if before I continue on with some of my other questions, I want to know whether or not you have something in place to capture those metrics, and so that if there's, if we see an overusage in an individual classroom, that there is some sort of alarm that goes off, a message that's sent to the principal of the building saying, hey, we think maybe you might want to check in on this one because the teachers are using, in their 90-minute blocks, they're using the computers for 75 minutes or 80 minutes of it.
So I'll start with that, and Mary Beth might want to talk a little bit about some of the technology metrics more specifically. But the first thing I would say is the program evaluation that we designed with Johns Hopkins University, you might remember when they presented the logic model that they presented that talks about the main kind of area that we're attempting to measure the impact is around instructional practice, and the secondary is around portrait of a graduate outcomes for students. So the entire program evaluation is really built around measuring impact in those areas. There are a number of different metrics, and they've been producing this 150-page annual report for us for the last couple of years that get at survey information, that get at the interviews that they conduct, observations, site observations, classroom observations, and focus groups. So that's the primary methodology to look at how are the instructional practices, as Kimberly was saying, shifting and changing. And again, recognizing that they're not going to change over time. So their time frame that they built in, which is a research-based time frame for change to instructional practices, is 3 to 5 years. But each year, after that baseline year, they've been providing where are we at now, and that information is available by school. So every school principal is able to get a school-based report that gives them the information about the random survey responses from their school and any of the individuals that might have participated in the observations, the focus groups, or the interviews. So there's that type of information as it pertains to the instructional practice. And then Portrait of a Graduate, as you know, we're building in additional ways to try to measure Portrait of a Graduate. We've developed a number of different instruments, from rubric-based instruments to our portfolio capstone project. And we've built some of those metrics into the streamlined strategic plan to start to try to measure more system-wide how our students are doing in developing those Portrait of a Graduate attributes.
I appreciate that, but I'm actually asking for something more intentional, because there are some studies out there about the impact on anxiety levels, especially for young teenage girls, of having too much screen time. And so I think we have to be intentional, because waiting 5 years to find out what the impact is, it means that we have 5 years of students that
Well, I wouldn't want somebody to think that we're doing that. I'm just saying the research around how long does it take for system-wide change to occur is typically 3 to 5 years when you talk about a change to instructional practice or an instructional initiative being implemented with fidelity across the system. The larger the system, of course, the longer that takes. But we're not waiting 5 years. That's why they've been doing that analysis for us year by year. And one caveat, I would just pause for a second on the screen time, because I do have conversations with individual parents. Sometimes I respond to emails that I get from parents about screen time. And as a parent, again, of a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, I understand the challenges around screen time. The research that we typically get when people are referencing research and talking about screen time really is not different than a lot of the research that we've had since the 1960s, when television first became so ubiquitous, and you didn't want children sitting in front of television screens, right, passively for hour after hour after hour. It's the same thing as the technology has changed and evolved, and it's the same set of issues and the same set of developmental concerns that we have with cell phone use now, right? It's students that are spending a lot of time passively engaged, using technology for entertainment, and that is not what we're doing here. So I just want to be
I understand that, Dr. Presidio, but I guess what I'm looking for is actually to have some sort of guidance to our educators, and some mechanism to ensuring the guidance is adhered to that limits the amount of time that our students are purely engaged in a relationship with their computer versus a relationship with their peers or with their teachers. Because as you rightfully noted, that personal relationship with teachers is incredibly important, probably more so in our higher FRM schools. And so we do need to make sure that we don't lose that human touch and that experience for them. So before I go on.
I just want to let you know you have one more. There's about one more minute before we'd like to move on.
Yeah, unfortunately, much of my time was taken by people responding, so I will, okay.
No, go ahead.
So the metrics continues to be a concern, as well as making sure that there's a sustainability of the funding. And so when I look at your FCPS financing options, a lot of the funding is dependent on the carryover from previous years, the initial rollout being the carryover from high schools, but then when we get to 2021, we have middle school carryover and elementary school carryover coming out. And so I guess my question is, what are we giving up when we're pulling money back for this initiative? Because
real briefly before we go to the funding question, I just want to continue to follow up on the question that you raised around screen time. And I do understand the concern that parents have, and I have that as a parent myself, but I do want to emphasize the distinction between screen time for passive entertainment purposes and screen time for educational purposes. And I think it's really important. It's a message that we're really trying to get out, not to the board, but to the parent community. So I really want our parents to understand that and continue to stay engaged in that question. And then there our metrics that I mentioned around the guidelines that I mentioned. And then I wanted Mary Beth to have an opportunity to tell you more about some more quantitative metrics in relationship to your question.
So that would be appreciated, and also how ongoing we're going to keep our parents engaged in understanding how much time their students are spending online in the classroom.
Yep.
So currently, we recently implemented a new internet content filtering application this summer, and it has a lot more reporting capabilities than the previous one. And we were able to see where some of the most highest usage sites are. And you may recall that we blocked Netflix this year because that was our number one use was Netflix, and there's really no instructional benefit from that. So that would be an example. In addition to that, we're working actually with Matt Eline at Robinson Secondary, who's been a leader in this, and we're doing an RFP, and some other high school principals are joining us, for additional classroom management tools. And you'll be seeing that RFP come out probably in November, with the goal to have it selected by the end of the school year for implementation next school year. So that will give us, our teachers, some additional classroom capabilities to manage the devices and what they're being used for in the classroom. So that is something that we are actively working on the requirements and getting ready to issue that RFP out soon.
And that's precisely what I was asking
Yeah,
about.
we're on it. We're on it. And then I'll pass it to Ms. Burton about the finances.
Yeah, I'm not sure with the carryover part, are you talking about the first line on the revenue section that says the carryover from the previous year? That merely reflects the difference between revenue and expenditures in the year before. So if you look at fiscal 19, the total amount of revenue that we have available in fiscal 19, this current year, is, and I'm looking at the level. Okay, just make sure you have the right one up there. So the total amount of revenue in fiscal 19 is 13 million, and the total amount of expenditures is 12.8. So you have $200,000 left over, and so that's carried forward into the next year. So this is, if our revenue projections are accurate or close to accurate, these aren't additional funds that you'd have to come up with. It will just automatically generate as a result of revenue being over expenditures.
But there is built-in refresh in this funding model. And so, although there's some concerns from some of our principals, a portion, we have dedicated 75% of our existing REOC funds, which is our replacement equipment, which as those have been around a long time, it's never enough to refresh our equipment, but we've dedicated 75% of that. We're reallocating that central funds. There's also a portion of the textbook funds that's an annual expenditure, and we take that as we get to each level. Those things, along with the fees, are helping us refresh this, and we have to get to a refresh. I've been here 19 years, and we've never been able to fund a refresh that's adequate. And so we believe that this is going to allow us that, plus some additional baseline money, which you see on there, which we've put forward, $5.8 million in the next budget year, to help us get to a true refresh cycle, so that schools will no longer have to be scraping along money to try to get their equipment refreshed, because we don't have the central funding to do that. So this is built-in model so that we can continue to keep this program rolling, and not just like the e-backpack schools where we've had a one-time, expenditure of devices, and they're all about going to be, they're close to being 4 years old already.
So the funding stream that you're asking the board to approve is that baseline where next year you would want us to add 5.8 million into the budget, and the following year 8.3, et cetera, et cetera.
It's actually not 8.3. It's aggregating. So you would have 5.8 million in the base for fiscal 21 already. So the increase would only be a couple of $1 million for fiscal 21, and then 2 million for fiscal 22, because those funds would be built into the base in the subsequent years. It's only an add in the first year.
So that goes back to the question I had, which is, what are we giving up for that 5.8? What are we not doing? Because if you look at the constant challenge with the Board of Supervisors in funding, if we were to presume the 2.5%, which is what the county executive has suggested to us, and we know what's happening in other areas what are we giving up for that 5.8? So if we want to spend here, where are we taking it from?
Ms.
Well-
Corbett-Sanders, is that something that we might be able to include in the next step to get that information, or were you guys prepared to answer that
Well,
question
and basically, we are
today?
asking you to prioritize this as part of that 2.5%. This is what we're asking the board to say, this is one of our priorities, and this is where that would be coming from. So that's what we're asking the board to make that priority decision.
And I would just say, and
Coming
then,
from where, I'm sorry?
The 5.8 million is included in the fiscal 20 preliminary forecast as a line item of something that we believe is important, along with salaries and those sorts of things. Now, certainly I don't want to usurp the superintendent's proposed budget process, but we don't know our funding levels yet from the county, the state. We have estimates, of course, but we don't know the actual numbers yet, and so that's the point that we would have to take a look at everything that we believe was a priority.
and that's why the outcome for today's work session is to get some clarity around, is this a priority to include in the superintendent's proposed budget that would cause the superintendent, staff, and the board to engage in that process of what are those trade-offs?
But I think, if I may try to understand, I think the question for Ms. Corbett-Sanders and probably many of us would be, what's the trade-off going to be? And if you can't answer that question, then perhaps that's something that we can get information on at a later date.
Well, part of the revenue sources for this project in fiscal 20 include user fees that will be paid by the parents of $50 per device, $25 for economically challenged students, as well as the textbook per pupil set aside. 25% of the textbook funds have been used for technology and things like that over the last couple of years. And so we reduced that by 25% at the high school level for this first year, and that is a permanent reduction. So that is a constant revenue source to this project. In addition to that, we are doing a one-time funding source from the high schools of 75% of their 25% carryover of the funds that they're not spending each year. And that is not permanent. That is a one-time. So
If I can interrupt you for 1 second, is any of this written somewhere? Okay, so I would,
It actually is written down in the next steps from last work session.
okay.
So you are correct. The next step is to clarify where that, the funding would come from and how much of it would be new funding, new prioritization of our funding, and at what we would look at deprioritizing.
Okay, hopefully.
the 5.8 is the new funding. The others
That's
are-
how I read it, too.
Yeah, the others are either being funded by a new revenue source or an existing revenue source that's being repurposed.
Okay, so I'm gonna guess we're gonna have more questions on that, but next I have Megan. Wait, how do I stop?
As your colleague, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, I would just say that this is extremely important, and if there's any questions you have after we've all gone, I encourage you to go back, because I know Ms. Schultz and everybody wants to stay on target, but this is extremely serious action that this board's going to be taking and directing the superintendent. And whether it takes another 15 or 20 minutes, we got to get it right, especially since some colleagues have talked about that we've spent too much time talking about it. I would argue that, we've gotten much better information with each successive work session. And so I'll start with a glow, which is I'm thrilled that you've brought this other implementation model to start at the high schools and not by pyramid. I think that this is a far more prudent approach. I also want to compliment you on some of the information you brought us with the other jurisdictions. That's extremely helpful to me as a board member to look at where we are in the Commonwealth. And it's not lost on me that a large portion of them are doing this from 6th grade to 12th grade. And so while I know we were instructed to stay in the lane of just talk about high school, I want the board Dr. Braybrand and our amazing audience of staff and principals who are here, that's a very serious part of this conversation, is how far do we go with a one-to-one device? And I don't think that's been settled by this board yet. And, but I am very comfortable in the mindset of what we need to prepare our high school students. So Dr. Braybrand, you talked about this alignment with Portrait of a Graduate 1, Fairfax, and our strategic plan, and I would agree with you on all those points. I think this just comes down to the delivery model and how we're going to implement this in the school division. And it's not just how we implement it in terms of material usage, professional development, instructional training, but the funding model is big. And Dr. Braybrand saw my very bad poker face just now on the funding component. And I appreciate that the answer to some of this might have been in a next step, but I do want to share again with Dr. Braybrand that I've shared with superintendents for 7 years now. The school board and the public, we have such a volume of information that comes at all times. People cannot remember which work session 12 months ago it was because we list them by date. When we are going to have an important conversation like this, those next steps that you guys answered for us, post them, attach them, because otherwise, again, we're jigging around trying to see if the next step got answered, where is it, and having it, anything that's going to help inform our decision making should be posted at the work session we're talking about. So I really appreciate Ms. Loveglass letting us know it got answered, but I don't have it in front of me, and I didn't even know when it got answered because, again, we don't have staff that track any of this stuff for us. So I appreciate where Ms. Corbett-Sanders was going on the funding model. It's very helpful to look at this revenue to expenditure and say, oh, it's almost like a wash. But it's not, in the sense that I have heard concerns about the impact this is going to have on our high school funding. 25% loss of per pupil funding on an annual basis. And if I understood correctly by this chart, just quick, yes or no, that 25% loss of per pupil funding is only their per pupil funding for their textbook allotment. It's not 25% of their total per pupil allotment each year.
Just textbooks, yes.
Just textbooks. So the other aspects of their per pupil funding remains 100% intact and not being targeted.
Yes, except for that we allow schools to carry up to 25% of any unspent funding forward into the next year. And so as a one-time revenue source as startup money, we are taking 75% of that 25% of unspent funds. But for the high schools, I think we've already taken half of that, and we still need to take the other half, because they wanted to split it up between 2 years, and we agreed to that. But that's a one-time reduction to their potential carryover.
So I do remember at the prior work session that was, again, something that the board wanted to better understand, that there was an ask to our principals to bring this money forward, even though the board hadn't necessarily, greenlit this happening. And so just everybody understanding, I think, to the question Ms. Corbett-Sanders was asking, the money is coming from somewhere. There is trade-offs happening. And I would prefer, I don't know that we have the time today, but I think there needs to be, Dr. Braybrand, a more direct conversation about what our principals will be losing in terms of funding from that. I think that needs to be part of the straightforward conversation.
Megan, if I could just real briefly, I'd like Aaron to be able to weigh in on that, because we started this conversation with the high school principals last year, and we continue that conversation with them now, and a lot of the high school folks are here. So, Aaron might want to just offer some brief comments.
So I might ask for some of my colleagues to come up, because I was not a high school principal last year whenever the conversation was started, but I know that we've been looking at the funding sources and the proposal, and we as an association actually are going to come together on Thursday to bring in the data from how much money we've been spending on technology and refreshing technology anyway. And what we're finding is preliminary data is a lot of us are spending way more than what this is actually going to take from our bottom line. So again, on Thursday, we're going to talk about it. I think Mr. Eline can come in and probably fill in a little bit more of the data.
And I want to preface something for Mr. Eline. You're the High School Principal Association president, correct?
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
I'm the former.
Okay. Well, the reason I say that is because I think there needs to be a little bit of a safety in position. So if you can speak even in that form. In other words, I don't want you in the hot seat because he's your boss. So I'd rather that you be able to talk from holistically how the principals feel about
Sure.
the fact that this is a loss of your operating funds.
Well, we did spend time in September, and Ellen Riley's the new president. The heat's really on her, not me. But we spent a lot of time in September and quite frankly, a lot of time in the last couple of years talking about this. So when you look at how much money we've spent on technology in our schools historically, it's astronomical. 1 year, I believe I spent almost $200,000. And what I want you to understand about that is only some of the staff gets access to that technology. And that's the issue, is I can't give it to everyone. I don't have that kind of base. So I think what you're looking at is now that we won't have to buy that kind of technology, those mobile carts, because I bought a mobile cart this year. It was $11,000. And really, it's only one teacher that gets to use it. So this is actually, in the long run, going to save us a ton of money, if you think about it, because we won't have to use money now for those mobile carts. For just a few teachers to have access, everyone can. So you have to kind of look at it that way. At first it looks like they're taking money, but when you sit down and really think about it, and high school principals have talked about this a lot over the last couple of years, this will end up saving us a lot of money and give all of our teachers access and all of our students. Right now, not everyone at Robinson has access. So I think that's what you need to look at. That makes sense?
So to add on that, because most people would think that, I'm new. Most people would think that our students at McLean are bringing in laptops and everybody has one, and that's not the case, because our teachers, there's not equitable in the classroom, so not everybody has a computer, so then the teachers can't use it. And so our students, right now, we're introduced Math Space, we've introduced Albert I.O. that our upper level math and AP classes are using, and then our students are now starting to use it more in droves. And our kids are actually doing more of their homework online and turning it in more, and they're more engaged. And if you came into our school now, you would see our teachers are preparing for it, and our kids are, it's not about the computer. And I want you to be really, I really want to cut down to, it's not about the computer, it's about that we're using flexible seating in there, that our teachers are using lessons that they're able to let a small group go off and then go work individually with other kids. And so the kids who just need more work, and they're able to circulate around the room more independently. Before, we used to be the person who had all the information, and now the information's here in this, and now it's teaching our kids those portrait of a graduate skills, how to be a collaborator, a communicator. It's really working with them in that way now. And so the dynamics of the classroom has truly changed. And it's talking to the kids this year, they've been excited, and it's been fun going into classrooms, and it hasn't been the teacher on the stage, it's been the kids doing the work, and it's been really positive. The funding, so I went back and I did look at my funding, and 3 years ago I spent $122,000 just on, I think about maybe 4 or 5 carts of computers. $50,000 will buy me 2 full carts. And next year, I'll be putting $50,000 in, and every student will have a computer. I have that I think that making sure that the kids have that access for every one of my students, and ensuring that every one of my teachers can post things and kids can go home and do the work, and I think that it's very well worth it.
Thank you. I guess I was trying to get a sense that if each of you is at your high school spending over $100,000 every single year, year in, year out, then yes, I can see that 50,000 you're putting back into the pool, but you're getting far more coverage to your students. That's one thing. I guess this just goes back to my initial statement, which is philosophically, and I do want everybody to know, Dr. Presidio, Mary Beth Loveklass sat down with me, and we probably spent 2 hours talking about this after the prior work session, because I felt like Kimberly Scott. I want the teachers to still be the dynamic instructors in the classroom, and I don't want them to be facilitators. I don't want them to be, classroom monitors. And so I think, Ms. Scott, I enjoyed meeting you years ago, and without a doubt, your testimonial today was very impactful for me. But Dr. Brabrand, to what my colleagues have shared to date, I think we need to make sure we've got either a school board or a school division policy regulation in place about maximum screen time based on, again, research on the brain. I don't want a good thing to end up being harmful to the developing brain that children have. I also want to make sure that, as Ms. Palchuk especially brought up, the cell phone policy changes. We certainly don't want kids still also using the cell phones on top of now this screen time during learning, but also how that incorporates emergency messages from families. I mean, anyone who's got a student in our schools with a cell phone knows, as a parent, that when you have to reach your child for an emergency, we are texting our children. And that's just real. And so how we figure that one out, I thought somebody mentioned blocking and, cell service, and then that would be a piece of it. But obviously, I think we cannot lose the fact that there are going to be times when parents and children have to reach each other on an emergency basis. So at this point, Dr. Brabrand, I guess I would say that the only way I can support this is if we roll this out at a high school level. And Dr. Presidio, you gave me the greatest comfort today in saying, then we see where we're at. How is that working at the high school level? I do think that middle school most likely will be the next step. I may not even be on this board when you get to elementary school, but I have great pause of anything below 6th grade at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Evans?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. My first question is, how many schools have gone one-to-one on their own without being part of this process? And one of the reasons I ask, I was at one of my Title I very high poverty elementary schools the other day, and they use their own funds to do this. And I'd like to know how typical that is at this point, that schools are using their own funds.
We do have that. We did include that in the next step. So we're going to see if we can find it while we're here at the table. Maybe we can come back to your question.
Okay. Was that from the last? Okay.
Yeah.
If you could link me up to that, I'd appreciate it, because
And it's a mix. There's different types of one-to-one. So we have those that have it one-to-one in all grades, and the students take them home. We have them where they don't take them home, but they still have them. And we have them where they have them just in some classrooms and some grade levels. So it's a mix across the county and a mix across schools.
all right, but I'd like to know how many are using their own funds, particularly if they're Title I schools, and doing that at the same time that we're waiting 4 or 5 years to get to the elementary school level. I have to say that, and the backpack initiative, what's the status of that at this point? That was grants program.
It's fully, we have spent the full grant. The grant has been implemented, and all the e-backpack schools have them at all grade levels, and the grant is over.
So the grant's finished.
Yes. There's no more funding for that through that grant.
Okay, so we would have to take all of that on ourselves.
No,
And
that's because it was a one-time grant and did not have any refresh, which is part of the challenge that we're trying to get beyond, is to have a refresh cycle.
And was that all at the high school level, remind me?
Yes, only at the
Okay,
high school level,
so-
including
okay.
Fairfax adult.
Okay. And I have to say, what's concerning me here is the idea that I hear all of my colleagues saying that they support starting with the high school level, but that gives me it gives me concern to think about how long we are going to wait to get to our elementary schools, our high poverty elementary schools, where we've got schools where kids don't have any computers at home. They don't have any access. And we did get a report, including some schools where a majority of the students don't. So I'm having a hard time understanding how we're going to justify providing this to low poverty schools and leaving the high poverty schools, a large number of high poverty schools.
One thing that I wanted to make sure that you're aware of is that the MiFis and the internet access at home devices are available for all levels, elementary, middle, and high, not just at the high school level. So that's actually available this year. So if you're aware of any student that does not have internet access, they can go to their school library and check out a MiFi.
I'm concerned about
There's
students.
many of our libraries also have devices to check out. Now, they're not necessarily the newest, greatest devices, but every library should have some checkout devices available as well.
I'm very concerned, though, that we're furthering a gap, that we will have, we will continue for many years to have elementary school students who get farther and farther behind their wealthier the wealthier students, because the wealthier students will have computers at home. And yes, there are plenty of students that don't have any computer at home. So the MiFi is not going to help them. They can go to libraries, but that's, there's limits on how much time elementary school students or any student, any individual can use. So I think that we put our low-income students at a tremendous disadvantage. So I think I see where this is going, but it concerns me.
Next, we have Mr. Moon.
Yeah, so we have Il Young, then Ryan, then Karen, and then me.
I know it's already 3:30, but I have some questions regarding funding models, and then state my positions on the options they presented to us. On the funding models, let's go to page number 20 when it says one-time funding schools mid-year. Is that one-time funding school mid-year? Could you explain that to me just one more time, what that is?
Yes, that is 75.
That's a 75% or 25% maximum. So that, since that depends on the amount of money carried over by high schools, if high schools don't have any carryover, not that that's the case, then
Well, we do that on a per pupil basis, and the total fiscal 18 is a 3.3 million in carryover, and the give is 1.2 million.
And tell Mr. Moon about timing. We're not waiting till the end, Lee, right? If we go forward, we're not going to wait till May for the pull.
Right. Last
I
year
see,
we took
I
it late,
see.
but we'd like
You're
to
not
take
gonna
it
wait
earlier.
until actually there is a carryover, because
Right.
principals could decide not to have any carryover, just expand all the money.
Yes, we are-
So that not to give up 75%.
They wouldn't.
Giving you some hints out there.
Mr. Moon, can I be a straight shooter, Lee? The principals already have said, Scott, take it now. We're ready to take it now. We want this to happen.
Just wanted to
Take it now,
clarify,
not
that's
in
what I
May.
thought you might do. Okay, now asking you a question about cumulatability of these expenditure items and revenues. I think Mary Beth earlier, I think basically answered my questions on revenue side, that it is what you see as FY 20 through 23 in terms of the revenue amount. That's a cumulative amount, right? The first year is only 12.2, but the second year we add a little more to become 18.6, and all the way down to $31 million. And we don't know what's going to happen after completing the implementation all the way down to elementary school level, whether that's going to go beyond 31 or it's going to be about that level, or
Well, fiscal 23 is the only year in this model that includes the refresh cycle for the high school.
that includes a refresh cycle for the high school, meaning 1, 2, 3. It's a 3-year refresh cycle then?
4.
1, 2, 3. You're buying in FY19.
Yeah.
Okay, got that. Okay, 4-year cycle. With a 4-year cycle, now let me go down to devices. No, I'm sorry, expenditures at the bottom here. So that first year startup, FY19, 12.4, and then I see 6.4. That's not the cumulative number, correct? First year you are spending 12.4. In FY20, you are only putting in 6.4, while are you adding 6.4 on top of that 12.4 to purchase devices?
It's the two together. That's the actual cost of the devices for the high school, except for some of that is outright purchases and some of it's lease.
It's a lease purchase. Okay. Okay, then let me go to a third year, FY21. When I say 9.9 for devices, is that whatever we may be needed for high school from prior years, if there are some lease payments left for high school, plus what's needed for middle school implementation for that particular year?
For the,
Middle school implementation, it's also lease payments that are factored in there.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Lease payments, some lease payments from high schools left to be continued in that year, plus middle school purchase payments.
Correct.
And the next year, 11.4 could be some high schools, some middle schools, and some elementary schools, and all the way down to 9.0 in the final year. That's adding up all of them, that year's payment. But in the following year, FY24, we don't have. Do you expect that numbers to continue growing, or is that now with all implementation done, with probably other than maybe inflation factors, it's about that amount?
Right. I mean, we would expect it to be relatively stable. I mean, there's certainly positions involved with this, and those salaries and benefit costs will go up. But as far as the initial outlay and the levels that we're seeing here, no, you'll see a stabilization in later
Now
years.
I'm going to go back to the revenue side because I'm going to Mrs. McLachlan's, one of the questions posed by Mrs. McLachlan about what are we trading off. Is that one of your questions? Corporate Sanders, sorry. Looking at FY 2013, we have a 5.7 for carryover, and then we have a 14.5 at the baseline. If you put them together, because a lot of times we use carryover to do something, correct? So we are putting in about $20 million that we could be doing something else, but we are using for this.
No. The 14.5, 10.3 of it is already going to be in your baseline. So the increase is only
No.
4.2.
FY 2013, in order for us to do this, we would be using 5.7 from the carryover. We would be using $14.5 million accumulated baseline number to implement this, which we could, if we don't do this, could be doing something else. That's the question, crux of that. That's the decision that board would have to make.
Yes.
Okay, now with those questions answered, that where I am is, I'm in full support of this. I think we gotta go with the high school. Some of the board members have some reservation about going to elementary school level. Funding decision is going to be one year at a time. Who knows? Who knows if economy tanks, there's another recession coming up. Great plan, we may not be able to do it. If there is a tax windfall from the revenue side from the state, and governor decides to give us General Assembly going along, which giving us a lot more than we expect, wouldn't be any problem. So budgetary decision is going to be 1 year at a time. But at this point in time, I am ready for high school implementation. I am ready for the middle school implementation. I might want to take a little pause after middle school implementation but might decide not to. Next year is an election year. We may have a whole bunch of new board members come up who may be deciding upon elementary school implementation at that point. So that could be a little pause point. But as far as high school and middle schools, I'm ready.
Ryan was next, but he had to step out, so I make my statements. I will say in theory that I take the same position I hear from my colleagues, although I have some concerns that the information, some of the questions that have come about wasn't part of the presentation or wasn't readily available to us. And that gives me some pause. I've got questions in a couple of categories. The first category is how we are monitoring even the pilot program. Is that information somewhere where, how, I know we've heard anecdotal testimony, and I know people want to move forward, and we all do. But I think we have some responsibility to evaluate what we've already done. And so do we have that? Do we have any information that the board could have been?
We've provided in the July work session the report from Johns Hopkins University Center for Educational Research. They provided a report to the board about the findings from year 2 of the pilot. The previous year, they provided a report about the findings from year 1 of the pilot. We do have the narrative reports, which are very lengthy, so I wouldn't expect a board member or a community member to be able to read the whole thing because they're over 100 pages. But those are posted on board docs as part of those presentations, and we'd be happy to send those out again. I certainly would be happy to meet with any board member or board members that would like to discuss the findings further. But again, that evaluation design is a multifaceted evaluation. It has surveys that are given to thousands of stakeholders, parents, teachers, and students. It has interviews that are given to randomly selected individuals in the phase 1 schools. And there were classroom observations that were done in the phase 1 schools. So we have a lot of information, but certainly I can appreciate that a board member would not be able to have that at the front of their mind because it's very complex and very dense. So I'd be happy to spend more time meeting with anybody that has further questions about the evaluation findings so far, or might have information that they would like us to try to include in the next phase of the evaluation, because we're going to work with them for year 3 of the pilot this year as well. And we're still working on defining the scope of the work for that evaluation for this year. Ms. McLaughlin and Ms. Schultz were able to give me a little bit of input during the summer on that as well.
And I appreciate that, and I realize this is this includes volumes of work. But when we have to make a decision, I kind of would like, even if it's in summary fashion, kind of what it is, what's the history of what I haven't had time to go back and pull back all the next steps and all the stuff you just mentioned. And I'd also like to know whether those measurements would have included, whether we have any measurements with respect to how it impacted achievement.
So again, I would caution us a little bit on that logic model that they developed. You would not expect to see any impact on student achievement at scale, again, depending on the size of the system that you're working in for 3 to 5 years. And we have really, really defined this initiative to be in alignment with Portrait of a Graduate, not trying to increase standardized student achievement scores. We have a lot of ways to measure standardized student achievement in FCPS, and we have not defined the initiative that way. Now, that being said, that is information that we're going to try to include more of in the scope of the work for future program evaluation years.
Well, just so I can focus my comments more. For example, if we're using this for, say, reading comprehension, are we able to measure?
And we're not.
Okay.
And that's a really important distinction. So We are not using a scripted curriculum that would be focused, for example, as you say, on reading comprehension. If you were, you could measure the impact of that in relationship to student achievement, but we're not using it that way. We're using it for critical and creative thinking, collaboration, communication skills, and that's been the primary focus of our professional development efforts, and our implementation work has focused around portrait of a graduate measurements, where we have not had as many system-wide opportunities to measure portrait of a graduate. So all of that being said, we can look at, including in the evaluation design in future years, look to try to figure out if we can have a correlation that would give us valid and reliable information with respect to standardized student achievement scores. But that is not what we're prioritizing in this initiative. So I just always want to give that caveat. I will say there is research, and like most things in social science research, you're going to find mixed results. But Ms. Strauss mentioned an editorial written by one of our students. And one of the things that I was so excited about that particular editorial is they actually cited research in the editorial, and they cited a study that is a meta-analysis, which is a study of studies that really did determine that there are measurable impacts on standardized student achievement scores when technology is used effectively and appropriately.
Okay. The other part has to do, so my first questions I think had to do with resource stewardship and are we really monitoring? And I'd like for that monitoring to include regular reports to the board with what, I think these are, for example, it would have been great if we had what we thought it was going to cost in the pilot and what it actually ended up costing. So that would give us a better idea, I think, of what those numbers up there or what you're projecting we need would mean in the future, which I would feel feel like it would give me a better standard and as if I was making good decisions. The other part is, how we're communicating with our parents. And so I would like to see, what that plan is and how we're planning to get feedback and what those concerns are, because certainly I've had people come to my office hours and, it may be all anecdotal, but it'd be great if we had some way to systematically measure what those concerns would be.
So we'll capture that for sure in the next steps, because that is an area that we've been working on. So I just want to remind folks, particularly in the community, that we did 5 community input sessions last school year in each of the 5 regions, and we're working this year with the Fairfax County Council of PTAs to find a more effective mechanism to get the message out, because those regional meetings did not really accomplish as much as we would like. And we've worked with the communications department to come up with a communications plan for this year that's multifaceted, so we'd be happy to share that with the board as well.
So I'm right up on my 7 minutes here, but my last point has to do with following up on my colleague's question, Ms. Evans, with respect to those areas where they may not even have a computer at home, and what kind of plan do we have? It may be a next step with respect to how to ensure equity in those high schools.
Well, I think, Mary Beth is going to log in here in a second, but if the board chooses to go with option 1, the implementation for next school year, 1920, would be for all of our high schools. So all of our high schools would be 1-to-1. And again, as we mentioned, we're recommending that approach because it gives us the ability to backwards map this down and into subsequent grade levels, lower grade levels, and each time it gives the board the ability to say, we don't want to, we want to make sure that before we vote to put more funding into the budget, that 1, we have the money, and 2, that we believe in the efficacy of the initiative. So different approaches accomplish different things faster. Option 2 is the pyramid approach, where you can prioritize on the lowest or the highest percentage of free and reduced lunch students, the largest percentage of economically disadvantaged students in those pyramids first, but then you're going to have inequities across some of the system levels, because you wouldn't get to all of the high schools, or you wouldn't get to all of the middle schools at the same time. So it's really which approach the board would prefer, but again, staff is recommending the bi-level approach, because we think addressing the inequities at the level first is the most logical way to approach this, given all of the implementation.
I guess what I'd like to take away to be from my comment, that I want to make sure that how we're impacting those particular difficult areas, that we are monitoring how effective we are, and that the board is getting reports on that progress.
Okay, very good.
Okay, we skipped over Ryan, so we're going to go to Ryan now.
Okay, thank you all. So I will say, I'll just start out by saying I haven't gotten many complaints about the rollout of FCPSOn thus far, but I will say the most complaints have been about the banning of Netflix. So Mary Beth, I don't I don't know if we can
That's
revisit that.
because you have a lot of students that follow you.
2 thumbs down on that, I understand.
Right. And as the counterpoint to Ms. Strauss's editorial, I do have the A blast in front of me, Mr. Thomas. The title of the top article this week is Technology Making Us Dumber? So I don't, I certainly don't feel that, and I think Mr. Presidio has done a good job laying out the case for FCPSOn over many years now, and I do think it's time to move ahead. I support option 1. I think from a systems perspective, it makes the most sense. As one board member, I think at this point I'd be happy to greenlight middle school and high school, but I do, like many of my colleagues, have concerns as we get it to the lower grades. So that's where I stand on that. And I would say also with option 2, I would assume there are some issues in terms of revenues with that plan, just because you will be subsidizing far more of the devices. So I don't know if we've mapped out how that would work financially, and if we would be able to be in the green in that plan. And we can come back to that if you want.
Okay. Go ahead, Lee. I'm sorry.
I mean, if you look at the pyramid option, you can see that we have made different assumptions about the user fees in the early years, in that we would think that those would be less, starting with the high schools with the greatest numbers of free and reduced students.
But you think it would still work out if we were to do that? Less optimistic.
It will still work out once the plan is completed, but it will be difficult along the way.
Right. Okay. So, in terms of the fee structure, I think $50 is reasonable, but I do think this will, assuming it's approved, merit a discussion among board members about our other fees. Obviously, we successfully removed the atrocious activities fee this past budget cycle, but obviously we have added other fees into our structure over the past decade that I think we need to look at. And remind me, from a legal perspective, I know very early on we looked into this, but we are fine charging our students for this, even though it's considered part of their instructional requirement.
John Foster was here. John, I don't know. I could answer this question. I am admitted to the bar, but I'm going to defer this to our chief legal counsel.
Good afternoon. Yes, Mr. McElveen, we looked at this earlier in the process, and we can charge a fee. The key point is that it is a fee. You can call it a security fee or an insurance fee, but it essentially replaces the laptop if it's lost or damaged. And other jurisdictions have approached it the same way, such as Henrico outside Richmond, and have concluded, as I have, that it is legally permissible.
Okay. Thank you, John. And then, one of my initial concerns had been actually one I had heard from principals about that 25% coming from them. But, I think the case has been made today that the principals are happy with how that funding is being used. So I'm glad to hear that resolved, at least in my mind. A couple things I want us to consider that we might not have already is that there will be infrastructure requirements, not only on the technical side, but on the classroom side as well. I assume as we move away from BYOD, all of our classrooms, if they don't already, will need cell phone holders or cubbies or whatever. So that's going to be another expense we add. On the other side, I would hope that now that all of our kids will have this kind of device, that we could potentially eliminate the need for purchasing graphing calculators. I don't know, just things like that, that come to my mind that I would like for us to consider, both on the positive side and on the negative side in terms of funding needs. And then finally, I agree with my colleagues on the screen time limits issue. I think we'll need to revisit that later this year. Thank you.
Brian, can I ask you a quick question? Are you suggesting they would use their computer for their graphing calculator?
Yes, my assumption is that technology would be built in.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I haven't been in a classroom in a decade, but I would assume so.
Ms. Schultz?
So I have some very specific questions. Obviously, this has been something that I've been passionate about for a very long time. The kids can blame me for the Netflix. I think I was the first one to ask that question. Make sure that got blocked, so I'll take the hit for that. On slide 15, if we could, please. So in these schools, while the notion was that we're quote unquote behind, is there any information on student achievement in these school districts before one-to-one and after one-to-one?
I am not aware of that. I haven't asked that question. We just did some research to figure out the current state of device availability.
Okay, so I would have some basic questions and have had some basic questions about what happens to student achievement, because theoretically, if we look at the wall, student achievement goals, academics is number one. So, and I appreciate the fact that there's not just one way to measure, but that is the accountability model, is that there is something to draw that this is beneficial, as opposed to anecdotally we're engaging in technology. And I appreciate the, maybe concerned teacher approach versus like what you've seen in practice. That helps, but it is still anecdotal in terms of what does it do to a student population. And it sort of weaves in and out a lot of the different concerns, things about sleep, things about access to other information that they shouldn't be accessing, cheating, all kinds of other things. So, what, pardon?
No, just go back.
Oh, see, I'm concerned about what's, I'm a mother, I have eyes in the back of my head. And then what it does on teacher climate surveys. Are we ready to go on a rollout at a high school level in teachers with professional development to get hit the ground running? And I ask, like, in comparison, the one model that I have is when we were doing world languages, it took us a while to ramp up curriculum to be integrated to receive the world language model. Are you saying that if we hit the button, you're ready to go next year, high school, all curriculum, all teachers are ready, professional development's there, everybody's ready to receive into everything from BC calculus to oceanography to honors English, everything's ready to go to receive a computer into the classroom?
So you've got a couple of really good questions. I'll start with the last one, and then we can kind of work backwards a little bit to your liking. No implementation is ever going to be perfect, right? And I think the larger the system, the more risk factors there are that you have to overcome. What I would say about this implementation is we've been working for several years now, right, to really try to figure out what are the professional development needs of schools. And we are already and have been working at the high school level for that readiness work to begin. And we didn't start with, how does your instruction have to change? We start with the culture conversations, right? Like, what kind of climate do we need to have in our school to be open to trying new and innovative practices? And what are the challenges that we're going to face, and how do we overcome those? It's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? I mean, we kind of started with, like, what are the most immediate needs that have to be addressed? So we focus on the culture and the conditions for the change that needs to take place at the school. Then we go to the classroom environment pieces and really try to make sure that we're going to prepare teachers successfully to be able to have these devices in their classroom in a way that isn't going to disrupt classroom management activities for them and isn't going to create additional workload issues and concerns. And then we go to the instructional components. And I think when we do that over time, as Kimberly was saying, expecting that we're going to continue to make progress, and everybody's not going to learn at the same rate as everybody else. I think we've had a lot of success at the high school level. So we are already a few years down the road at the high school level starting this work. And I think that that's going to give us more positive conditions for success.
I think that's important because for me, it's not just, there's two sides of this coin. There is student preparedness to be educated in this model, but there is also the educator climate and the receptivity to flipping curriculum on at all high schools, months from now, less than a year from now. Did you have a comment on that?
Kimberly maybe just give her a second.
Elizabeth, I really appreciate that from the teacher's point of view, and I wanted to just say something about the idea of those mobile carts. There was nothing like the mobile carts to create division among colleagues. It was so frustrating to try and barter your third grandchild to get that mobile cart for the writing lab that you were trying to fit in or the e-cart assessment that had a benchmark window. That was one of the reasons I quit believing in the fidelity that I was trying to give to using technology as one of my most effective tools. So the year that we went on to our FCPSOn, I was thrilled that there would be equity among teachers. And one of the reasons it worked so well was because of that climate emphasis of we're in this together, it's one tool. And my department, my building, our pyramid, I'm sure, we began to think of our technology as one of the CLT questions we asked every time we met. So what is it we want students to learn? Is there a place where technology is the best way to deliver, assess, or redirect? So that's key. And last thing, because I don't know if I'll ever have this opportunity again, I do agree that a 3 to 5 year time frame for growth is so critical. And if you don't emphasize that, teachers will react out of fear and maybe even resentment. And as we all know, we can do a lot of talking in this room and a lot of PR, but it always comes down to the teacher behind that door.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that is, we spent a lot of time talking about the student, but I do want us to remain engaged on that teacher component. Speaking of the teacher component, and because I'm lucky enough to have, most of them are still here. I have an amazing showing of my principals. I just want to thank them for being here. But is there any withholding of curriculum offerings now or planned from the pullback of the monies? I just want to get this on the record. I know the answer. Sometimes you ask questions you know the answer to. But are we not offering curriculum choices this year or planned for next year because we've pulled back monies?
No, and I do appreciate you asking that question. And we are going to continue to follow up. The board's asked some questions about, discontinuation of different courses. World languages are one area. We're going to continue that discussion in our December work session on world language expansion, but no discontinuation of courses due to FCPSOn.
Okay, so I'm watching my time. I do think that we've missed an opportunity to talk about savings, and you were wonderful, Mr. Eline, in bringing up what you would spend at the school level, and I think the gap of potentially what it would cost under the existing framework versus what you're proposing, we're missing that. We talk a lot about what things cost, but we don't talk enough about paths or options of what savings would result. And so, I wish we had that, but we don't. But in that vein, can we go to the options, the math budget page? So what I have a concern about, I have a question about, and I don't like to do math out in public, but I'm running some back of the envelope numbers here, and we have about 59,000 high school students. 59,000, if you assume about 30% are free and reduced meal, at 17,700 at $25 a piece, that's $442,500. That leaves the remaining 41,300 at 50. That's 2.06. So I'm trying to get to, okay, that looks to me like 2.5 million. How is the 2.5 million there going to result? That's assuming every single student pays their fees. What happens if people don't pay? Do they get a computer anyway? Do they not get a computer? What happens if the board says, nope, we've gone the path of user fees? I appreciate Mr. Foster coming up because I had written down questions of free versus free and appropriate education. I mean, I don't even like the fact that we ask students to buy their English novels. I mean, it's supposed to be public education. So if it's required and everybody else in the classroom has one and a student doesn't, then what? I mean, this presumes that all the numbers hold into place, and I'm not sure that you get 59,000 students cutting a check for $25 or $50 a piece.
Well, I can just tell you what the assumptions are, and the assumptions are that we have 60,245 high school students that would be affected. We use the average free and reduced percentage for elementary school, middle school, and high school. So just for high school on this, and we included a slippage rate of 5%.
Do you think only 5% out of 59, but I mean, that was pretty good back of the envelope, 59,000 students. I'm pretty proud of that. So 59,000, you think only 5% aren't going to pay? So is that the amount that didn't pay when we had the other student fee?
That's a completely different animal.
That's a pretty good benchmark. And I think it was a lot higher than 5%. I'm just saying to my colleagues, as we're discussing money and how we're funding this, I think you have to imagine that out of that 2.4, when you look at the baseline, because correct me if I'm wrong, but anything that doesn't get paid in that 2.4 then moves to the 5.8 baseline. Okay, and we don't have a high school only model version of this? I'd hoped maybe we would, but no.
We do have a high school only version of this.
Oh. It's just not in the presentation. Okay. All right. Well, that's unfortunate. So I guess my last point is that on the cell phones, I will commend, I can only speak, while I've been to the other high schools, in terms of practice, I've only seen at Robinson the operationalization of this. And I have seen exponentially more teachers go to a sort of a receiving model, some kind of a device at the front of the room where the students store their cell phone. I think that is a huge part of the problem. I do think I've recommended several different subject matter experts out in the technology world where this has happened, and there is a huge distractibility and cheating and cyberbullying. I mean, when I started with the board, we didn't have any of this, and I'm thrilled. You know, I mean, I'm pushed on a lot of this, and I'm really, really happy with where we are on that. If we are to go to sort of reducing, and I guess I disagree with my colleague, Ms. McLaughlin, on this, is we all survived, you know, our entire educational careers, and if our parents need to get a hold of us, they can call the front office and somebody can come send a note to the school and your student can call home. I mean, this isn't a phone, it's a supercomputer. And so pulling the supercomputer away from the constant presence of students, I think would be happy. So I would be happy. So under this model, I reluctantly, and this is a big one for me, but I reluctantly am behind a high school only model. I think there are much more significant brain development concerns at the younger ages and screen time and everything else. And I think it gives us more time, but I also think you must build into this the reciprocal model of providing us feedback on how it's going before you anticipate, you know, rolling this out any further. So that's kind of where I stand with my colleagues.
We have a few go backs, but I just wanted to make sure, and I think you mentioned to me you were going to ask this question. Is there anywhere where we have information about how other jurisdictions, slide 15, dealt with, no, how they dealt with the costs, where the costs come from. Did they charge fees? Did these other people, did they charge fees?
We'd have to do more outreach and research to be able to answer that
So we
question.
don't
We
know
didn't
that.
really focus on that. We were just collecting kind of the device.
Okay.
Alvin does not charge fee.
All right, first go back is Ms. McLaughlin.
Okay, two things. First of all, I want to echo something that Ms. Evans said, and I didn't really hear a lot of people then sort of pick up on it. It's very concerning to me, the anecdotal stories that we continue to hear of the individual schools, and of which we have 200, who by wealth and opportunity went around and did their own one-to-one digital device. I not only have a massive problem in terms of equity, I mean, that is paramount, the biggest problem. But the second thing is, we're all talking about the essential need to implement this with the greatest of educational professional development and care. And when we allowed our individual schools to go ahead and say, but if you want to go ahead and do one-to-one devices, have at it, you know, maybe I'm just in an Irish mood today. It's educational recklessness on the part of the division to have allowed that to happen. I don't think it's appropriate. I think if the principals wanted to do that, the regional superintendents and your leadership team should have had a conversation, and it should have come to the board, because we're now hearing from individual schools, both the at-large board members, certainly I am as a magisterial board member, where parents are coming to us and saying, I thought you hadn't even approved one-to-one digital devices, but it's in my elementary school. And so I did not want this work session to conclude without saying that elephant is in the room, and if we don't have that conversation as soon as possible as a board with Dr. Brabrand, it's just going to keep happening. And an equity piece and an educational responsibility piece are both on the table when we're talking about that. I just got an email from parents in one of my elementary schools saying, we're piloting it in 2 of our grade levels. It's, Braddock District doesn't have a pilot going on for one-to-one. So why is it happening? So that was my number one question. Then I have one other.
We're limiting go backs to 3 minutes because we want to, so if you have one other question, get it in. You got 59 seconds.
My other question is, I happen to have been very excited to see that the principal of the Chantilly Pyramid, we have Scott here, and I'd like to have Scott Poole's voice added to everything that we heard today, because he's the one who's living it with his colleagues in the Chantilly Pyramid, but we didn't hear him talk today. So I was going to invite him to the microphone. So while he talks, if anybody wants to, this allows Scott to collect his thoughts. But Scott, I do want to know what you're thinking about these 2 concerns.
All right, so
We'll let Scott Poole
you want
go
Scott
first.
Poole? I thought you wanted him to collect
I want you to
thoughts.
collect your
I'll
thoughts.
collect my thoughts.
You're our guest, Principal Poole, so I'm not going to sledgehammer you with the time
Thank
code.
you. Scott volunteered as chair, but I didn't want to take the superintendent's seat at the table. But in all seriousness, thank you. I have been fortunate to be at Chantilly now for about 1.5 years. I'm also a dad in the Chantilly Pyramid, so I've viewed FCPSOn both as an educator but also as a parent. And I just a couple thoughts. I mean, first, I do think that I share, in fact, I just wrote a message to the community 2 weeks ago about concerns about screen time. And it was, I sent an excerpt from an article that was related to personal devices, and was there a relationship between them and increases in depression and anxiety. And I editorialized more than I usually do, because my belief is that as a parent, I am concerned about how much my own kids are on their devices. Of course, these applications in many cases are highly addictive. But I think it's important to point out that when I watch my kids using their laptops, I don't see that problem. They are working. They are, whether it's because of the filtering devices, which I'm sure are significant, but it's also the assignments, and they're not loaded up with all these social media applications and streaks and that kind of thing. So I see a big difference. I also think that if you look at the devices, or the laptops, they're really becoming almost like just an essential tool. If you think about all the things that are happening in schools, one, the increase in testing. We test now we have some sort of testing going on every month except one at Chantilly, and all of that testing is done through laptops, except the AP and I believe IB. I'm not sure about IB tests. So that's just one example of how often they're used. We also, we've found too, they've been really helpful when students are absent. They can access the materials that they need, either through Blackboard or through Google Classroom. Teachers can provide feedback in a way that they can't when we don't have those kind of devices. Those are just a few of the things. I had a bunch of my notes prepared and my keyed out here. The other things that I wanted to talk about is it's already been mentioned, but the piece about the equity and access, I think is just, it's hard to overstate how important that's been. When you all talked about professional development, I wish you all could have come just last week. We had our second annual Chantilly Pyramid Collaboration Day, where we brought together all of the staff members in the entire pyramid came to Chantilly. And we're utilizing what we call the cohort model. So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, everyone is allowed to work together. They choose folks who have similar interests in regards to utilizing education technology and how it can enhance instruction. And really, we can view this as an instructional practice, not just a device. And we allowed teachers to form their own groups, and they decide for the rest of the year when and how they're going to meet. Some of them collaborate online. Some of them meet in person. And in that way, we are allowed to differentiate professional development in the same way that we are pushing and asking teachers to differentiate for students. It's interesting, we always talk about how important it is to meet students where they're at, but oftentimes when we work with adults, we go back to the PowerPoint and everybody sit and get. So I was really impressed by the work that I saw, and again, it allowed everybody, and Teresa started that motto before I got there, just try one thing. And it really is, I believe, transforming the way that kids work with each other, with their teachers. If you come to another one of the things that Teresa started, which I've continued, is that we allow them to submit furniture grants, or they can raid the warehouse to get furniture. And what we do is, once now that students are working, in many cases in collaborative groups, they're working online in some cases, and they reconfigure their classrooms. So instead of walking in, you'll find at Chantilly sort of a crazy quilt of arrangements in each classroom, where they're letting the instructional needs of the space drive the way it's configured, as opposed to the old industrial model where everybody sat in rows and the teacher was up front. A lot of classrooms, you walk in, you don't even really see the teacher. They're walking around and the kids are all working in spaces, then they'll stop, the teacher will get everyone's attention. And it's really exciting, and I say that not just from my observations, but just listening to and observing when I go into classrooms and see what's happening. And people that kind of like Kimberly, when they started, they were kind of a little bit apprehensive, but then they get involved and they see what it can do. It really changes their attitude. I can speak personally. When I was a professor for University of Virginia, and I worked with the accelerated certification cohort. By my second year, I did everything as a professor online, and it was awesome. I could grade online. They could turn in assignments online. I didn't give any paper except for some articles and things that they chose, and I returned them. And it really, it took me a while to get going on how to do it, but I could give feedback faster. Even before I saw them at the next session, I could utilize Google applications and we configured, this was before Classroom, and they could submit things online, I could grade it, and then it was imported into a grade book, and then also sent the feedback directly to the students. And then they could also work on projects remotely. And if you think about, like my son at Lee's Corner, he watched a safari online where they got together, and this wasn't one-to-one, but just in general, what you can do in terms of connectivity. And they went on a live safari. They all sat in the classroom together and watched it as a camera was set up on this Jeep, and they drove around through the forest and listened to the guide.
That's terrific.
So it's just so many different ways that you can, when students have that tool, that they can access the world around them.
I think Dr. Ivy had a comment about what
had
you
a
had said.
question for you, Scott,
Sure.
because you've been in the unique position of having been a principal
Mhm.
in a school that was not, a high school that was not one-to-one
Correct.
versus where you are now at
Mhm.
Chantilly. And I wondered if you could just speak for a minute about some
Sure.
of your observations. and
Yeah,
comparisons.
when I left Woodson, I felt bad for Dr. Floyd because I had spent, I think, over $80,000 a few years in a row just to replace aging technology there. So it was a real problem. And the idea of bringing, as Ellen pointed out, a permanent solution to this ongoing need to replace devices was huge. Even this year at Chantilly, I spent just the start of school this year, $28,000 on additional laptops because we had more students than we had last year.
That's the savings that I'm hoping that
Yeah.
going forward we can capture. I think, Karen, you have an announcement.
I do. We'd like to recognize Ann Holton, who I believe is formerly Secretary of Education in the state of Virginia, and she's has our students from GMU taking a course on education policy. So welcome.
You get to watch how education policy is made. It's like watching a hot dog. It's not pretty.
Sausage, right?
So we have two very. I'm going to ask my colleagues to be extremely quick in their go backs. I have Ms. Evans.
Ms. Schultz, I know it passed over, but Dr. Braber was supposed to answer my question on what are we going to do about the fact that elementary
You're
schools
absolutely
are-
correct. I'm going to revert my train driving back to Dr. Brabrand for just a second.
We can certainly look at that, Ms. McLaughlin. I would tell you, this is not a year old. This issue is as old as Fairfax County Public Schools. We have given schools great discretion in how they've used funds, do trades, and schools over the last 20 years, many have invested in technology, many have chosen other instructional ideas, and it's something we can look at. And some have had the support of community groups to purchase technology. So that's part of the reality. It's not something I initiated when I got here, but it's something we can certainly talk about, and I welcome the discussion
All
with
right,
the
so
board.
I might disagree with you a little bit on it's just like trading positions. It's not. As I mentioned, this is a massive equity issue, and it's also about educational responsibility, because if they're not implementing one-to-one with everything that everyone's described that needs to be done in a responsible way, it's wrong to just say, go ahead and do it if you want to. So my next step is going to be whether this board takes the position to direct you that we've got to have a work session as soon as possible to say, for all the schools who've done it to date, they're going to need to have gotten the professional development that we're doing with the pilot and what we're controlling at a division-wide level, and that for everyone else, this isn't just if you can fund it, go ahead, because then it goes right to what Ms. Evans said, and I'm not comfortable as a board member that if people have contacts and connections, their kids are going to get something else that you don't get somewhere else in the county.
If for expediency's sake, Ms. McLaughlin, I'm going to ask if you would not mind sending over the next step worded how you want it, so that will help us at the back end. Ms. Evans?
Well, first of all, thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. I appreciate you following up on my comment. We were sent the next steps, and I'm not seeing the list that I had asked for.
We can send that out. There's basically 64% of our schools, 124, have some type of one-to-one.
124.
125 out of 196 who reported, which is about 64%. Now, again, that one-to-one is not school-wide, but it's some type of one-to-one grade level type thing.
And so you have a list that tells us, how much it has at each school?
We can do it. We can't tell you how they were funded, because you have to remember that
but
computers are funded in a variety of ways.
But-
Grants, PTAs, central funding, school funding.
Okay, so that's interesting. That means, 2/3 of our schools already are one-to-one.
Now, again, they might be one-to-one with a whole hodgepodge of devices. These are not what we're talking about in terms of having a consistent type of, they might have cobbled them together. Some of them may be 10 years old. I mean, again, they're not refreshed, but that's what they report of having some type of one-to-one
And I
environment.
have to say that that goes back to Ms. McLaughlin's point, where we now have this being rolled out because people feel they need to do it at their schools, and yet it's not it's not consistent then, and they don't have the consistent professional development. They don't have it consistent from school to school, even though we have 2/3 of our schools. So anyway, so I would appreciate getting that if you've compiled that as soon as possible. 'Cause
Yeah, we can get
apparently
that out.
It was not in the next steps. My other question then, I continue to have the equity issue, but in the Chantilly pyramid, what were the challenges then rolling it out? What were the lessons learned at the middle school and elementary school level?
So we talked about some of those during the last work session. And again, I mean, some of the themes that we've touched on today related to teacher preparedness, really making sure that we start with the teacher preparedness. Again, some of the responsibilities that we talked about today, making sure that we're really focused on digital citizenship skills with our students because they've got these devices and how they're using the devices. So we covered a lot of that content in the last work session. I'd be happy to go into that in a little bit more detail with you offline. Might be the easiest way to do that.
I guess what I'm asking you is, what did we learn that was more difficult at the middle school level and at the elementary school level than at the high school level? If we think that it's easier to roll out at the high school level than to roll out through a pyramid, because we now have the example of having rolled it out at the pyramid level, and so what was the downside? What did you find that you didn't like about rolling it out at the pyramid level?
Right. So through our kind of evaluation reflection process, we didn't really compare implementation models because we had only implemented in one way. So when we developed the implementation recommendation to develop, to expand FCPSOn by level, it was really more of the factor of a couple things that we've discussed today again, trying to think about the students who need those devices as soon as possible. Again, we're in year 3 of this implementation. We'd love to be able to go faster, but we definitely understand the financial costs and constraints and some of the questions that board members have about the efficacy of expanding it at different levels. So it's like, where do you start, right? And looking through the perspective of who are the students that need to have this as soon as possible. We believe all of our students need to have this experience, but understanding that we can't give it to all of them at the same time, where do we start with? And that's starting at the high school level where they're going to need it for college and jobs, and starting backwards from there.
So I appreciate that, and I'll just make the comment that I continue to believe that the students that need it the most are the ones that don't have any computer at home.
Karen Corbett-Sanders.
I'll be very brief. I just wanted to follow up on some of the comments that have been made already today and request that you actually share with the board the information that you collect with the technology app, that your RFP for the metrics on the efficacy of the rollout. This is what you're working with, I guess, with Principal Eline.
Ellen Riley's actually on that group as well, but yeah, we're working on it's in the requirement stage. It'll be part of our standard briefing that we do in the Brand briefing in terms of a contract. We'll let you know when the RFP is issued, and then we'll let you know when it's concluded.
It's beyond just issuing the RFP. It's actually the results that come out of the RFP, because it's those metrics that are going to be key to us better understanding the efficacy of the rollout at the high school level, and ideally with the middle school as well.
Okay.
And so I would just request that not only you keep us up to date when you go out for that contract award, but the results of the application being put into place and how that is influencing the way we do
Well, I'm
roll out
imagining for a purchase this large, this is going to be a contract that's going to have to come to us for approval. We're
No,
going to have to approve it as a board.
But I'm fine with approving it as a board. I want to see the results after it's been implemented. That's more important to me. Okay, and then the second piece that I just wanted to ask is you mentioned the benefit of a laptop versus the handhelds because of access to social media apps. So are you planning on putting a block on social media apps?
That right now is a school-by-school decision in terms of, because one of the things that we also use a lot of these social media apps for communication, so we don't currently block them, but we were talking about, we do block a number of applications such as Yik Yak and a lot of these other types of tools that are not sort of your standard, that's primarily used by adult social media like Facebook, which the kids don't use anyway. So it's a mix of applications and social media that we block and don't block. So it's a case-by-case basis. It's also based on the usage and the bandwidth usage and the distraction usage. So there's a number of factors that go into it, which ones that we block. But any school is also allowed to request an unblock or a block of a particular application. But one of the things we were talking about is the cell phone usage. We don't have the ability to block cellular usage, other than a few apps that we block by geocaching, like Yik Yak, that they can't even get to it from their cell phone. But that's a very extensive and complicated process to block cellular. That's why we'd like to have the cellular phones turned off during the day, because we don't really have ability to block the sites from those devices.
So my next step is, as we look at our SR&R next year, that we be very intentful on the use of social apps on the devices that we are sending home with our students, so that we actually have a consistency across the system.
Well, we'll say that on the MiFi devices that we send home are blocked at the elementary level. So I will also tell you that we have different levels of blocking. High schools have more access than middle than elementary. And because the MiFi devices have the potential of being used like for a whole family and could have elementary students, even the devices we send home with high school students have the elementary settings. Does that make sense? So they have more blocked. More things are blocked on those that go home.
I would just posit that if there is something that has been deemed to be block-worthy at one high school, I think somebody would have to explain why it wouldn't be good to block at all high schools. And that's way down the rabbit hole. I don't want us as a board to get involved in that discussion. That's operational, but I do think it's a conversation that needs to happen. Can we get next steps up? And as those are coming up, a question that I didn't get to ask earlier, but it's part of next steps. Is there a way to do a baseline survey of the student population and the teacher population before we do the rollout, to sort of have a baseline set of information that we can then later reference as we're looking at, many of the questions my colleagues and I have asked, to say.
That's the Bright Bites study. And we're doing, the Bright Bites will go out, that survey goes out to all of our high schools teachers at the end of this year and before next year. So we have that, and that's a part of that's in the budget.
Well, I'm not entirely encouraged that it's Bright Bites, because that gets back into my Silicon Valley is accessing education dollars, and they're a big, all
I'm saying
not
is
going after
it's a commercial product that we can also has already built-in questions and things like that, but
all right,
whether it's that, but we do have plans to survey
if
the
it's
teachers at the end of the
turnkey-
year.
If it's turnkey and it saves us money, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, this is the slippery slope of the starting of being dependent upon, joint venture capital money, which wants to access educational dollars, which is a question I've brought up many, many times. So
Right, that tool also has national benchmarking, which helps us too. but
Okay, all right, that's fine. All right, so we're going to go through these. I'm going to try to do these very quickly. If you could read ahead to your bullet to make sure that it says what you think it says. We're going to start off with Ms. Palchek. While we're implementing high school FCPSOn, give periodic reports back to the board on cell phone use policies and practices. Do you mean at an individual school level?
Well, no, this is the conversation we had, so individual, but how we're getting to the county-wide. So it could be, if right now it's different by school, yes, I'd like to know by school.
And you guys understand what she's asking? Okay.
That
All
makes
right.
sense.
Consensus, yes? Yes, fine, okay, moving on. Clarify where funding would come from this year and in subsequent years, and what might have to be defunded to support this program. Ms. Corbett Sanders, good? Consensus, yes? Yes? Develop and implement a regulation regarding maximum screen time. Ms. McLaughlin, yes, thank you. Provide regular reports to the board on costs projected compared to actual. Is that including the actual revenue received from fees as well? Good.
This is Karen.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Yes, but we had a pilot. We don't have a report on how they projected that, so we need some sort of comparison.
Okay. Consensus, yes, please. Thank you. Share with the board community outreach efforts and how information about the program is communicated to parents. The FCPSOn program, the rollout?
Yes.
Can we just say how information about the program, how FCPSOn rollout is communicated to parents?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, can I see consensus on this one, please? Yes, thank you. Number 6, schedule a follow-up work session in which the superintendent will report on how many non-pilot have one-to-one and how this impacts FCPS's commitment to one Fairfax and fidelity to educational best practices used in schools. Is this correct, Ms. McLaughlin? Great. Can I see consensus on that? Marvelous. We're moving right along. 7, can we slide down, please? What were the challenges at the middle school and elementary school in Chantilly Pyramid? Challenges in the rollout, implementation, use?
Both. All of the challenges as part of the rollout within the Chantilly Pyramid at the middle school and elementary school level. What were the lessons learned?
Is that something that you all have?
You've already got middle school and elementary school.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm looking at.
I'm just asking, is this something staff has, or are you able to create, or?
I think
We have that
it's the
we have that
lessons learned
information in
that
the-
from our pilot.
Yeah, we have that information in the John Hopkins evaluation.
Okay, consensus, yes, thank you. Inform Board of Results once application is put into place.
Once the classroom efficacy application, for want of a better term, how do you want to describe that,
It's
Ms.?
a device classroom management tool.
Okay.
Device classroom management tool. Device classroom management tool is put into place, and the outcome of the implementation. Yes, please. Yes, thank you. Suggestive. As we look at SR&R next year, include social network guidelines and blocking recommendations. Yes, please. All right.
Ms. Schultz,
Mr.
Ms.
Schultz.
Schultz, I'd like to capture the other request that I had to provide the list of all schools that have implemented one-to-one on their own.
That's number 6.
Number 6, wait, schedule.
Yeah, I had asked for the non-piloted elementary and middle schools.
And how, okay, so it's how many? We've already gotten the answer to how many. I want to see who. I want to see which ones.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think we should have the list.
Right.
So we can say report on how many
Right.
and the list. You want
I want, yes.
And how many in which non-pilot?
And which?
Just up above. How many in which non-pilot ESMS? And which?
Since we're discussing that one, can I clarify whether you just need the information or you need a work session to discuss that?
I just want the list. I want to see which schools. I mean, we may need a
Well,
work session afterwards, but.
I'll be honest, I put it in there and people voted on it. The reason being is, it's one thing to get the information, he could send it in a Brayburn briefing. The problem is, I think we have to then look at that list and have the conversation. Are we okay with the fact that we've got these schools out there that have done it? Do we want any more to be able to do it? Or do we
Okay,
want to? So I
with
think
that-
the work
that's fine.
session's
Then
needed.
if you just want to combine 6 and 10, you can say how many and which, and which.
Right. I think-
I'm primarily looking at which schools.
Okay, we've got that.
Okay,
If we
all
put
right.
in which, we can tick off 10. Are there any more below?
Mr. Schultz.
Yes,
I
Mr.
think
Moon.
one very important next step missing from today's discussion
Yes, sir.
in my mind is directing the superintendent incorporate into his proposed budget to be presented to the school board in January, funding needed for implementation for high school next year. I mean, he needs that guidance from us so that he can prepare the next year's budget.
Well, yes, because I asked if there was a high school only model, and it
I
exists.
said high school for the next, we're doing 1 year at a time. So, direct the superintendent to incorporate into his proposed budget for the funding needed for implementation for high school next year.
So I was going to ask for the high school only model, but I think that you've plussed up the request to make it better. So direct the superintendent to incorporate into the proposed budget in January, funding needed for the implementation in high school for next year. Can I see consensus on that, please? Okay. Oh, Mr. McElveen.
Sorry, I think mine's very brief, but I did want staff to give some thought in terms of infrastructure savings as well as additional expenses, whether it's classroom, whether it's the graphing calculator, or the cell phone pouch, or things like that that might be.
Or the central purchasing, as opposed to what
Right,
we heard from the high school, that they were expending.
And the carts, those carts.
Right, that they were expending at the individual level for refresh versus the central purchasing. So any infrastructure savings with this program will provide. Can I, yes, I'm assuming, yes? Thank you, yes. Okay, so we're finished with this.
1 second. 1 second.
No, oh, no.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Meeting manager on meeting manager. All right.
There were just a couple of things that people mentioned I took notes of. I want to make sure that we included them, or we at least.
Okay, Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Thank you.
I yield to you.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. There was some concern about best practices in terms of effectiveness of teaching models and measurements based on portrait of a graduate and anxiety levels. Where would we get that type of a report as an ongoing issue?
Well, again, the majority of that is answered in the Johns Hopkins program evaluation. So you'll get that on an annual basis.
Okay, and then there was also a concern about ongoing metrics regarding screen time. Did we address that there?
So, yeah, so that's the one that Ms. Corbett Sanders helped us craft. Some metrics around that.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we covered people's concerns. Thank you, Ms.
No,
Schultz.
that's great, thank you.
I give my time back.
There's no time to give back. It's 4:43. There is no time to give back. Okay, so we're going to conclude 2 on our agenda, which was we're inauspiciously further behind. I want to thank Ms. Corbett Sanders